In the quiet hours before sunrise, when the Pacific still holds the night upon its surface, a lone Japanese naval diver broke through the water with slow, deliberate movement. His body rose in silence, silhouetted faintly against a pale horizon, droplets running down the sides of his mask as he drew his first breath of open air. Beneath him, the sea concealed the twisted remains of a sunken escort vessel, one of dozens lost in the scattered reefs and shallow anchorages of the Central Pacific. Many divers before him had descended into these wrecks, searching for tools, machinery, or the remains of those who never escaped. Most returned with little more than fragments. But this diver carried something else. In his right hand, secured tightly as though it might slip back into the deep at any moment, was a waterlogged canvas pouch, its surface torn, its seams swollen, its weight unmistakable. Inside it rested a Japanese naval codebook, once used to coordinate entire formations of ships across thousands of miles. It was believed lost when the vessel sank weeks earlier. Yet here it was again, pulled from the sand and darkness by a man who had no idea how far its influence would travel. He only knew it was important. He did not know it would end up shaping radio intelligence across the Pacific. He did not know it would revive encryption patterns American analysts had nearly abandoned. He did not know that his discovery, quiet, accidental, and buried beneath 20 meters of seawater, would ripple through the unseen war of signals, messages, and code breaking. In that moment, as he floated between night and dawn, he simply clutched the pouch and waited for the boat crew to pull him aboard. What he could not have imagined was that this fragile object, softened by salt and pressure, would alter the pace of intelligence across the Pacific campaign. One diver, one wreck, one codebook. The rest of the war would move because of it, though the diver himself would never learn how. The escort vessel had been resting on the ocean floor for nearly a month when the diver descended toward it. During that time, the Pacific currents had softened the outlines of the wreck, pushing fine layers of sand into every open seam and draping strands of seaweed over the jagged metal. The ship no longer resembled the vessel that once patrolled shipping routes. It resembled a collapsed spine, bent in the middle and half buried in the seabed. Above it, the water remained deceptively clear, as though unaware of the violence that had torn the vessel apart. American carrier aircraft had struck it during a brief but devastating raid. Witnesses from nearby islands recalled the explosions echoing across the lagoon and the sight of smoke rising like a pillar over the water. The ship sank quickly, bow first, leaving only scattering debris on the surface. In the chaos of the retreating fleet, there had been no time for salvage or recovery. Only later, when order returned and the war front shifted farther east, did Japanese command assign divers to search the wreck. The diver chosen for this operation, Petty Officer Masaru Kanda, was used to these depths. He had spent his early life working in coastal fisheries off Kyushu, where diving for abalone had taught him patience, awareness, and a quiet discipline needed to navigate underwater spaces. When he joined the Navy, those skills translated naturally to salvage duty. He was not a warrior by nature. He was a worker, accustomed to long hours in the cold and dim. As he descended along the rope line, Masaru felt the familiar pressure increasing around his helmet. The water cooled with each meter, and the outlines of the ship slowly emerged from the blue haze. At first, it looked like a dark smudge against the seabed. But as he drew closer, the details sharpened. Twisted plates, shattered guns, a collapsed radar mast, and sections of hull that had buckled inward from the force of the blasts. He hovered just above the deck, letting the sand settle before moving forward. The ship's stern section was partially intact, though tilted at a steep angle. The superstructure had collapsed, leaving a passage of broken walls and leaning beams that created a maze of shadows. Masaru moved cautiously through the debris, careful not to disturb anything that might shift or collapse further. Every movement stirred clouds of silt that drifted upward like smoke. His task was simple on paper: recover mechanical components, document any surviving equipment, retrieve sensitive materials if found. But divers rarely found anything of value. Most codebooks were burned during evacuation, and those that weren't burned were destroyed by seawater long before salvage crews arrived. The chances of recovering anything meaningful were lower with each passing day. Still, Masaru followed procedure. He checked storage lockers, rifled through rusted toolboxes, and inspected sealed compartments where documents might have been stored. Most were empty or filled with pulp that had once been paper. The water had erased nearly all traces of what had been written. He moved deeper into the stern, where a narrow corridor led to the communications room. The door had been blown off its hinges and now lay half-buried under fallen cables. Masaru squeezed through the gap, careful not to snag his suit on the sharp metal. Inside, the room was a ruin. Equipment racks lay overturned, the radios themselves torn apart. Charts drifted freely in the water like translucent leaves. On the far wall, a filing cabinet had toppled forward, its drawers forced open by impact. Masaru swept his light across the room, taking in the slow, ghostly drift of debris. Then something caught his eye. Near the cabinet's base, half buried in sand, was a rectangular shape. It was too regular to be debris, too solid to be paper, too compact to be machinery. He knelt, brushing away the sand with careful motions. The object emerged slowly, a thick canvas pouch, its exterior scorched and frayed. The buckles were sealed shut by rust, and the fabric felt unnaturally heavy under his glove. Masaru recognized the shape instantly. He had seen similar pouches before, never intact, never salvageable, never recovered from such depths. This was a codebook case. There was no mistaking it. He lifted it gently, testing the weight. Something shifted inside. That meant the contents, whatever remained, were still present. It didn't matter if the pages were wet or damaged. The Navy demanded the recovery of all sensitive material, no matter the condition. Masaru tucked the pouch under his arm and began retracing his path through the wreck. The ship groaned faintly as he passed, as though the movement of his fins disturbed the last fragile tensions holding the twisted metal together. He ascended through the broken superstructure, pausing briefly as a loose beam drifted downward behind him. By the time he reached open water again, the sun's faint rays were filtering down from the surface. He didn't know what the pouch contained. He didn't know whether it would even matter. He only knew that it was rare enough to change the routine of his salvage dive into something that carried weight. He rose slowly, one hand always gripping the rope, the other holding the pouch tightly against his chest. Above him, the surface shimmered with morning light, and beneath him, the wreck faded back into silence. When Masaru broke the surface, the early morning light had just begun spreading across the lagoon. The sea around him shifted in gentle ripples, carrying faint reflections of the sky. He felt the cool air rush into his suit as he was hauled aboard the small salvage barge, the deck creaking beneath his boots as he stepped out of the water. The divers on deck were accustomed to long stretches of quiet after a dive, but this time they noticed immediately that Masaru carried something unusual. He placed the canvas pouch on the wooden planks with a heavy thud, water draining steadily from its corners. Its weight was undeniable, dense, compact, and telling. The supervising petty officer approached, wiping his gloves as he crouched beside it. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he observed it in silence, studying the warping of the fabric and the rusted buckles sealed shut with salt. There was no question what it was. Code pouches were standard issue, reserved only for encrypted naval communications and ship-to-fleet protocols. They were built to survive fire, shrapnel, and sudden immersion. Even when submerged for long periods, some of their waterproofing survived, leaving portions of the contents readable. It was an item that should never have resurfaced. Protocol dictated that such material be handled with extreme care. Even damaged codebooks could reveal patterns, call signs, and operational details that enemy intelligence must not acquire. But this pouch had gone down with the ship during a rapid evacuation. It had been presumed lost. No official record existed to indicate that the crew destroyed its contents before the vessel sank. And because salvage operations only began weeks later, Japanese command had already implemented temporary replacement for portions of the code. This recovery introduced a rare opportunity, but also a risk. The officer ordered the pouch transferred immediately to the district intelligence station. Masaru felt a moment of curiosity as he watched it being stowed in a protective container lined with cloth, but curiosity was not something divers in his position indulged. Their work was physical, not analytical. Their job was to retrieve, not interpret. Still, he couldn't help noticing how the officer's demeanor changed the moment he recognized the object. It was subtle, a tightening of posture, a sharpened focus, a lower tone of voice when giving orders. Salvage work was routine. This was not. The barge began its slow return toward the naval outpost. The engine hummed beneath the deck, vibrations passing up through the planks. Masaru removed his helmet and sat near the railing, letting the wind cool his face. Drops of water rolled down his sleeves and dripped into the sea. The lagoon stretched quietly around the boat, its surface deceptively peaceful. Beneath it lay wreck after wreck, an underwater graveyard of the Pacific War. Masaru thought of the room he had entered. The darkened walls, the floating papers, the silence of steel that had once carried voices, signals, and orders across ocean distances. He wondered why the pouch had survived when so much else had not. He wondered how long it had rested under the filing cabinet, shielded from the ocean by accident or by the last act of an officer who had attempted to secure it before the ship went down. The boat eventually reached the pier. The pouch, still dripping, was handed off to shore personnel who carried it with deliberate caution toward a storage room used for classified material. Masaru watched it go, feeling a faint sense of closure. His role in the matter was done. He would be assigned another wreck tomorrow, or perhaps the following week. Salvage operations never slowed for long. But somewhere inside that storage room, an intelligence officer was already examining the edges of the pouch. He pressed the fabric gently, testing for internal stiffness. The seams were partially damaged by heat, indicating that the ship burned before sinking. The buckles would have to be cut open. Inside, the pages were likely fused together at the corners. But even partial pages could carry codes, ciphers, or operational indicators still in circulation. He placed the pouch beneath a warm air vent to begin the drying process, careful not to force it open too quickly. Patience was essential with documents like these. Too much heat, and the ink could blur. Too much moisture removal, and the pages could crumble. That afternoon, the officer made his first incision. Using a small knife, he cut gently along the rusted frame of the buckle. It snapped free. He slowly unfolded the canvas flap and peeled it back. Inside was a cloth-wrapped book swollen with water, its pages pressed together like layers of clay. But the ink, specialized naval ink, had bled less than expected. It was smeared at the edges, but largely legible. The officer carefully separated the first few pages using thin metal sheets inserted between them. Each separation revealed lines of printed codes, signal instructions, frequency tables, and call sign structures. It was not a complete or pristine book, but it was intact enough to matter. He took notes, copying numbers and sequences onto clean sheets of paper. Several entries had been struck out or amended in pencil, suggesting that updates had been made shortly before the vessel was attacked. That alone gave the document value. It showed the transition between older protocols and the new system implemented after the sinking. For the Japanese, this material offered a backward glance into their own evolving communications network. But the real consequence was hidden, subtle, and unintentional. The recovery would lead Japanese command to readopt certain tables they believed secure. Tables that had been partially compromised before. Tables American analysts had nearly stopped monitoring because they assumed them obsolete. This mistake would not be realized until much later, when intelligence officers traced unexplained message patterns and began reconstructing the underlying cause. For now, on this small island, under the soft hum of a ventilation fan, a single officer continued peeling open the pages of a book that should have dissolved into the sea. And Masaru Kanda, unaware of the broader significance, stepped back into routine service. Another diver whose actions ended with the simple handing off of an object. He couldn't know that this object, pulled from 20 meters of salt water, would soon influence decisions made in rooms far from the Pacific, in places he would never see. The intelligence station that received the codebook sat on the edge of a modest island outpost, one of many scattered across the Central Pacific. It was a place built not for glory or ceremony, but for steady, quiet work. The walls were thin, the radios hummed constantly, and the officers who worked inside them lived in a world defined by patterns, numbers, and transmissions drifting through static-filled channels. When the partially restored pages of the Sunken Codebook were placed on their desks, no one expected the document to hold significant strategic weight. After all, it was damaged. It belonged to a ship that had already been removed from the operational chain, and it reflected communications tables from weeks earlier, tables supposedly replaced by emergency protocols after the sinking. But the Japanese Navy, strained by losses and rapid redeployments, had not yet fully transitioned to new systems. Command believed some of the old structures remained safe because they were never confirmed compromised, and because this salvaged codebook resurfaced within their own control, they assumed the original loss had been contained. This assumption would create openings that rippled far beyond the island. The first link in this chain reaction began innocently. The officer in charge examined a set of frequency allocations identical to older patterns but with minor modifications. Believing these adjustments sufficiently secure, he recommended reusing parts of the older structure to stabilize communications across local fleets. Higher command approved the recommendation. This decision, quiet and bureaucratic, occurred with no awareness of its future consequences. It was just one of thousands of daily administrative choices made across the vast machinery of the war. But at that very moment, radios across the region began transmitting signals that carried echoes of the past, echoes American intelligence recognized instantly. Thousands of miles away, inside a cramped, dimly lit room where American codebreakers monitored Pacific transmissions, a young analyst paused over a sheet of intercepted numbers. The sequences felt familiar, not identical, just familiar in the way a melody is recognizable even when played in a different key. He marked the message, filed it, and waited for more. Over the next several days, additional transmissions arrived carrying similar shadows of earlier patterns. Some were fragmentary, some contained minor shifts, but together they created what intelligence officers call signal fingerprints, unique, subtle signatures that allow analysts to link messages across time. One morning, an analyst placed several sheets side by side on a long wooden table. Lines, numbers, and ciphers spread out before him like an incomplete map. He traced them with the tip of his pencil, comparing them against older archives. Slowly, the picture formed. The Japanese were reusing fragments of older protocols. This was unexpected. It suggested either a shortage of encryption material or an internal recalibration of communication structures, both exploitable situations. The analysts compared the new intercepts against partially reconstructed patterns obtained months earlier, discovering alignments that shouldn't have existed. In effect, the divers' recovery, though entirely unknown to the Americans, had nudged the Japanese system back into a recognizable rhythm. The analysts wrote their conclusions into a report. The report moved upward to regional commands, and from there, to fleet intelligence units. Soon, American submarine captains received more precise estimates of Japanese convoy routes. Carrier task forces gained sharper awareness of possible reorganizations of the Japanese fleet. Reconnaissance pilots were directed toward regions with increased radioactivity, and long-range bombers, whose missions depended heavily on tracking enemy logistics, received refined intelligence briefs that hinted at future targets. Changes were subtle at first, slightly more accurate predictions, slightly better intercept planning, slightly clearer situational awareness. But over time, these slight advantages compound. War is shaped not only by large battles, but by the steady accumulation of small informational edges. The Japanese command had no idea the older tables were vulnerable. They had no idea their internal salvage efforts had inadvertently reopened a window that American analysts had been struggling to keep open. And they had no idea that one diver's retrieval had produced a shift in intelligence visibility across the theater. This was the nature of wartime codebreaking. In a domain where messages are locked behind layers of secrecy, clarity comes not through dramatic revelations, but through narrow slits of light that analysts must widen with skill and patience. Meanwhile, Masaru Kanda remained entirely unaware. His world was the underwater gloom of wrecks, not the invisible war of signals pulsing through radios. He continued performing salvage dives, each one a separate task, each one isolated from the larger machinery of wartime decision-making. He did not know that the pouch he had handed over had become a quiet pivot point, turning the wheel of strategic intelligence ever so slightly. He did not know that his discovery would soon affect operations far from this small island. And he did not know that American analysts, thousands of miles away, were beginning to map the contours of Japanese fleet movements with renewed accuracy because of fragments he had recovered by chance. No one on the island knew, but the war would soon feel it. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, where naval formations moved like quiet storms and supply lines stretched over thousands of open water miles, intelligence was the thread that stitched the movements of fleets together. It guided submarines into position, directed reconnaissance aircraft toward distant coordinates, and informed commanders at sea when to advance and when to wait. Even the smallest fragment of insight, an intercepted call sign, a repeated frequency, an unusual silence, could change an entire operation. By mid-1944, American intelligence teams had already gained momentum in decoding Japanese naval communications. But the process was never straightforward. Encryption tables evolved, keys rotated, and call signs changed often enough to keep analysts constantly working to stay ahead. The enemy's signals did not break open in one dramatic moment. Rather, they revealed themselves in scattered clues that analysts had to assemble like a mosaic. This was why the shift caused by the reappearance of older communication structures mattered so deeply. As Japanese commands unknowingly reintroduced tables derived from the recovered codebook, American intercept stations began observing patterns they recognized. These patterns had been painstakingly analyzed months earlier, but had fallen out of use, leaving analysts with incomplete reconstructions. Now, the fragments resurfaced, providing continuity that the analysts had long sought. The effect was not instantaneous, but gradual. A convoy that might have passed undetected was now more likely to be shadowed by submarines. A destroyer squadron repositioning itself across an island chain no longer moved in obscurity. A carrier's attempt to mask its location through deceptive signaling became easier to decipher. In places as far apart as Hawaii, Australia, and the Aleutian Islands, American code-breaking rooms began building clearer models of Japanese naval logistics. Each intercept added a new piece to the puzzle. Messages that once appeared isolated now belonged to larger structures. Unclear patterns linking refueling ships, escort divisions, and transport groups suddenly aligned with older intelligence. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Fleet commanders began receiving reports that combined older, decoded fragments with newly interpreted traffic. Patterns of radio silence were tracked. Units believed damaged or missing were suddenly detectable again through their signal behavior. Even when the content of the messages remained encrypted, the metadata around them, routing, timing, structure, painted a picture of movement. It was enough to influence strategy. American submarines, tasked with strangling Japanese supply lines, positioned themselves with greater accuracy along convoy routes. The results showed quickly. Sinkings increased. Ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were intercepted more frequently. In some cases, entire convoys disappeared before reaching their destinations. Air operations benefited next. Long-range patrol aircraft used refined intelligence to identify regions where enemy units were likely massing for future operations. Reconnaissance flights, once cast over broad ocean expanses, now focused on narrower corridors. Each successful sighting fed back into the cycle of intelligence refinement. In naval headquarters, planners began to incorporate the updated signals picture into their broader strategic assessments. It offered a clearer understanding of Japan's remaining capabilities. It revealed weaknesses in their logistical chain, and it hinted at regions where the Japanese Navy was already overstretched. All of this emerged from the quiet, unnoticed reintroduction of older communications patterns linked to a codebook that should have remained at the bottom of the ocean. Japanese officers, acting under the belief that the salvage had prevented any compromise, continued using modified versions of the older table for weeks. They had no reason to suspect that the Americans had detected the rhythm of their signals returning to familiar ground. Thus, the radio waves across the Pacific carried echoes of past structures, and every echo allowed American analysts to sharpen their predictions. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Masaru Kanda knew nothing of these developments. To him, the war remained what it had always been: worn tools, damaged vessels, the heavy weight of diving equipment, and the cold quiet of the deep. He continued descending into wrecks, recovering debris, and surfacing in the early hours with a numb exhaustion familiar to every salvage diver. He never heard the radio traffic. He never saw the decoded fragments. He never knew that American submarines, circling silently in the dark ocean, were now navigating with confidence, partly because of data linked to his discovery. Yet his actions lived on, carried through signals across thousands of miles, shaping how fleets moved and how battles unfolded. His dive had reached into a different dimension of the war, one without explosions, without uniforms, without the sound of engines. A war fought in pulses of electricity and sequences of numbers. And the effects of this shift were only beginning. Masaru Kanda's world existed at a depth where sunlight faded into muted blues and the silence of the sea wrapped itself around steel and shadows. His duties never took him to strategy rooms or signal stations. He did not hear encrypted messages echoing across radio waves. Instead, he worked in places where wreckage rested like frozen memories, where twisted beams and shattered bulkheads became landmarks in an underwater landscape shaped by violence. To Masaru, the war was not an abstract contest between fleets and codes. It was the cold feel of the diving ladder under his hands, the tightening of straps on his helmet, and the steady descent into spaces where no sound existed except for the regulated hiss of his breathing. These dives were dangerous, exhausting, and lonely. Yet they were also familiar, a continuation of the underwater life he had known long before the war called him into uniform. In the weeks following his recovery of the codebook, Masaru returned to the same routines. The salvage unit received new assignments as damaged ships, bombed piers, and abandoned outposts needed attention. Fuel shortages, shifting fronts, and the decline of Japan's naval strength meant that their work grew harder. Replacement equipment arrived slowly. Rations grew thin, and the divers often had to repair their own tools using improvised parts. Some days the sea was calm, and they descended through clear water. On others, storms churned sediment into thick clouds, forcing them to navigate blind. But no matter the conditions, Masaru continued his work without complaint. His superiors regarded him as reliable, precise in his movements, steady under pressure, and unshaken by the claustrophobic spaces of submerged wrecks. He took pride in the discipline of salvage diving, even though few acknowledged the importance of the job. Salvage crews recovered usable components, preserved fuel, and salvaged machinery needed for repairs. They also retrieved documents and materials that might compromise security if left behind. Their work kept the Navy functioning in small but essential ways. Yet Masaru never knew that his most consequential dive had already occurred. While he navigated dark passageways underwater, the world above him shifted. American submarines, benefiting from updated intelligence, tightened their grip on Japanese supply routes. Merchant ships struggled to move between islands without encountering periscope wakes in the distance. Fuel tankers, once elusive, became easier to locate and intercept. Aircraft patrols also strengthened. With improved understanding of Japanese deployments, long-range reconnaissance units flew more targeted missions, identifying harbors where ships gathered, tracking convoys in transit, and guiding strike groups to strategic targets. Intelligence, once fractured, began forming a clearer picture. And in rooms where commanders reviewed daily briefings, subtle confidence emerged. These changes were not dramatic, not the kind that would appear in a headline or a victory announcement. They were incremental, an extra convoy intercepted here, a destroyer located there, a supply chain slightly disrupted. But their cumulative effect was profound. The Japanese Navy found itself increasingly constrained, reacting to movements it could not fully anticipate. All the while, Masaru remained unaware of his indirect influence. His days rotated between dives and preparation. He washed and dried his equipment after each mission, checking valves and inspecting seals. He replaced worn straps and tightened fittings. In the evenings, he sat with other divers on the pier, their conversations muted by fatigue. They spoke of weather patterns, of currents, of the quiet satisfaction of retrieving intact machinery from wrecks. They rarely discussed strategy. They did not know enough to discuss it. Occasionally, Masaru thought about the pouch he had recovered. He wondered whether the officers had extracted anything useful from it, or whether the pages had dissolved into unreadable pulp. But these thoughts were fleeting. Salvage divers did not receive updates about the fate of the items they turned in. Their world moved too quickly for such reflections. As summer deepened across the Pacific, Masaru's responsibilities expanded. He was assigned to deeper dives, often into wrecks lying at the edge of safe limits. His expertise made him indispensable. Younger divers looked to him for guidance, though he gave it without pride or expectation. The sea had shaped him long before the war. The war merely gave his skills a different purpose. Above him, far beyond his awareness, The intelligence advantage built quietly by analysts grew sharper. Each intercepted message refined fleet predictions. Each prediction influenced the movements of ships, aircraft, and submarines. American forces advanced steadily across the Pacific, island by island, narrowing the distance to the Japanese homeland. And somewhere in that chain of advancing operations was a thread woven from Masaru's discovery, a thread connecting the dim silence of a sunken communications room to strategic decisions made thousands of miles away. Masaru never knew that the codebook he had retrieved allowed analysts to identify and interpret signal structures that would otherwise have remained hidden. He never knew that his dive contributed to the shrinking mobility of the fleet he served. He never knew that his quiet work had entered a realm of warfare defined not by metal and fire, but by patterns, timing, and invisible signals traveling through the air. His war was the deep. The world above him, shaped by his actions, was entirely different, and neither side would ever realize how closely they had touched. In the final months of the Pacific War, the great movements of fleets and the thunder of distant battles overshadowed the quieter, unseen forces that shaped them. Reports circulated of islands taken, convoys sunk, and airfields seized. Newspapers and military communiques spoke of decisive actions carried out by admirals, pilots, and infantry units. But few mentioned the work of divers, intelligence officers, or analysts who labored in obscurity, individuals whose actions rarely earned recognition yet contributed to shifts that altered the very fabric of the conflict. Masaru Kanda's life followed this pattern. As the war accelerated toward its conclusion, his dives grew fewer, not because the wrecks disappeared, but because fuel shortages, logistical collapse, and the steady loss of naval positions reduced the need for salvage operations. Many of the ships he once served were gone, scattered across the ocean floor as silent markers of the nation's losses. In those final months, Masaru focused on maintenance tasks, equipment storage, and occasional shallow inspections. The deeper dives became rarer and eventually ceased altogether. When the war finally ended, he returned home to a coastline far removed from the strategic tensions of the Pacific. His neighbors knew him as a fisherman, not a diver who had retrieved a fragment of the war's secret machinery. He resumed a quiet life on the water, casting nets in the early morning light, watching the seasons shift over the narrow bays he had known since childhood. The war, for him, was a series of memories suspended between the calm of the surface and the stillness of submerged wreckage. He never learned what became of the codebook he recovered. He never knew that it had been transported from one intelligence station to another, studied by officers who documented its damaged pages, then archived it among other classified materials. And he never knew the full extent of the ripple it created in the intelligence war of 1944. Yet the consequences lived on. American codebreakers, guided by the reappearance of familiar structures within intercepted messages, sharpened their understanding of Japanese fleet behavior. Submarines positioned themselves with greater precision. Reconnaissance flights found targets with improved accuracy. Naval planners gained a clearer sense of enemy intentions, enabling operations that would otherwise have been clouded in uncertainty. The war did not hinge on a single codebook or a single diver. History rarely turns on one event alone. But the course of the conflict, shaped by thousands of small actions, was undeniably influenced by Masaru's unintended contribution. A diver descending into a broken hull, a pouch buried beneath months of sand, a set of pages that should have dissolved into obscurity, a series of signals that analysts recognized because of old patterns made new again. This was the hidden architecture of wartime intelligence, built not through dramatic revelations, but through quiet intersections between chance and discipline, between the work of a diver and the insight of analysts half a world away. In the end, The diver returned to a peaceful life, unaware that his hands had once lifted an artifact that altered the tempo of a global conflict. The code book remained stored in an archive, its ink fading slowly, its pages stiffening with age. And the sea once again claimed the wreck from which it had been taken, covering it with algae and coral, erasing all trace of the moment when a single discovery brought the silent world below into contact with the invisible war above. The Pacific rolled on, indifferent and eternal. But beneath its surface, in rusted steel and buried sand, the legacy of that quiet dive endured. An unseen chapter in a war defined by both the noise of battle and the silence of a lone man rising from the deep with a secret in his grasp. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.